So I'm really happy to do this because I'm actually responsible, some might say culpable, for bringing these two gentlemen together to start their beautiful friendship and very fruitful collaboration. Just about 5 years ago, Jared, who was working for the State Department, took a tech contingent to Baghdad. It's unprecedented to take people like Jack Dorsey and people from YouTube, Hunter Walker YouTube, into a war zone. And I talked my way into that trip as an embedded reporter. And when I wrote an article about it for Wired, it came to Eric's attention. And Eric said, I'd like to meet this guy. And a few months later, they were in Baghdad, where they found they had a lot in common. And Jared eventually joined Google to start a new division called Google Ideas. And then they've created this book called The New Digital Age, which is just out in paperback, and this is proof. And that's going to be the focus.
$10 on Amazon.
What about Google Play? No Google Play?
It's on Google Play as well.
Not first, huh? And that's going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about today there. Both what they wrote in the book, and particularly they wrote a really interesting new afterword, which talks about what happened since the book came out there. Now, what really impressed me about the book is the two of you did not just sit in a war room at Google and bang out something. You went to, 35 countries?
At least.
At least, yeah. And
mainly unstable autocratic countries.
There's a problem with Jared that you didn't tell me about. He doesn't like going to stable countries. We went to North Korea. He's never been to South Korea.
And you guys went to North Korea.
Yes, and it's just, think of the hotels alone.
Is it tougher to get a room in North Korea or South by Southwest?
It's actually tougher here.
Yeah. And what's interesting, when you fly into North Korea, there's no North Koreans on your flight. And then when you fly out of North Korea from Pyongyang to Beijing, it's filled with North Koreans who don't get off the plane. Their job is to basically eavesdrop on your conversation to see what you have to say about the North Koreans. And then it's very awkward because you get off the plane and they're all still sitting there and go back to their country.
And by the way,
Very
North Korea is breathtakingly beautiful with the clearest air possible because there's no manufacturing.
Maybe I don't know if China wants to adopt that.
And there's no automobile exhaust because there's no cars.
So one thing you talk about a lot is the effect of the digital on the world there. And you're really talking about a tale of two civilizations, the virtual and the physical world. One thing you talk about is the nature of the digital world in terms of uprisings, political uprisings and oppressive regimes there. And in the book, you were still fairly optimistic about things like Arab Spring. And since the book came out, though, I noticed, I don't know if you call it a hedge or whatever, but certainly Arab Spring looks like winter in New York City now. And afterwards, you were talking about it, and you say, well, connectivity can also draw people into conflict. I'm curious, considering what we see there, what we're seeing in the Ukraine, has anything happened to dampen your enthusiasm about the role of the digital in terms of people taking charge of?
No, I think we're very enthusiastic about the empowerment of mobile phones and connectivity, especially with people who don't have it. Right? It's a one-time huge shift of power to citizens who literally don't have the benefits that we take for granted. In the book, we actually say that revolutions are going to be easier to start, but harder to finish. And in the first version of the book, we could not have forecast that Egypt would go full circle back to a military government. And what's happened in the last year is that the governments have figured out that you don't turn off the internet, you infiltrate it. In the book, we talk at some length about what Egypt did, and they turned off the internet for 4.5 days, during which some, shall we say, not so smart person in the government started putting out SMSs that were clearly designed to get pro-government support, which of course didn't work because people didn't trust it. But when you turn off the internet, the average person said, one, these guys must be really, really afraid, and two, they just took off my internet and I'm upset. So instead, the new model for a dictator is to infiltrate and try to manipulate it. And you're seeing this in China and in many other countries.
And of course, this happened, something similar happened in Ukraine. Yanukovych, in an effort to silence the opposition, tried to shut down Channel 5, which was the opposition's main television station. But already in 2014, he came to the conclusion there was nothing he could do to stop social media. So what was the consequence of this? It just gave people yet another thing to complain about with regards to an ongoing frustration with the autocrat running the country.
Yeah, but I mean, but even shutting those things down would seem to indicate, as some people have said, that the internet is really useful in helping organize, a revolution, just like organize like a meetup here. But when it comes to post-revolution, maybe not so much.
But let's talk about both the vision and the limits of the vision. So let's start with somebody. The majority of people live on $1 a day in corrupt countries with poor connectivity, no communication, no textbooks, no education, and poor entertainment, and no reliable electric power. That's a fact. One of the greatest things that's going to happen in this next 3 to 5 years, another billion to 2 billion of those people are going to join us, get access to our world by virtue of smartphones. Smartphone prices are coming down fast enough that they become affordable. This is a huge achievement. We're going to talk about this for decades, right? The impact on them, we take for granted. A new phone comes out, we go, oh, well, look at all this new feature. For them, it solves their education problem, it solves their safety problem, especially for the terrible things that happen to women in these countries. It's how they monitor corruption, it's how they entertain themselves, and so forth. So let's not forget the enormous benefit for billions of people. What's the limit? Right? And Jared and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Where does it end, right? And it ends at the point of a gun. Right? So the fact of the matter is, in Syria, you have the world's worst both humanitarian conflict right now, 9 million people displaced, more than 140,000 people killed. Think about it. In a proxy-based civil war of multiple players all using sort of the sort of land to do terrible things to each other. It's just horrific. Without the internet, without reliable internet power, there's not much our industry can do, unfortunately. And in fact, Jared points out that you get a certain blindness to this. After so many videos of the atrocities, people say, oh, yes, there's another atrocity. This is an atrocity, right? So we've got to come up with some way of translating that knowledge into action. And we don't know it in our society yet.
Well, and in Syria, I was just on the Syrian border about 3 weeks ago, and I had spent a bunch of time there between 2004 and 2006, living in different parts of the country. And to paint a picture of just how severe the situation was there, I saw friends of mine that I hadn't seen in probably about 8 or 9 years. And they told me a story about smelling something strange that was coming through the window, starting to get dizzy, their throat started to itch, their eyes started to water, and then they passed out. Fortunately, somebody came in from the other room to close the window. The chemical weapons had seeped in through the opening, and it took them a month and a half to find out that it was, in fact, a chemical weapons attack. Now, I hear stories like this. It obviously paints a horrific picture of what's happening, but what they told me next was even more horrific, which is in the major cities in Damascus, Homs, Aleppo, and elsewhere, the government has literally set up checkpoints where they ask you for your phone and then ask you for your login information. If you won't give it to them, they hold a gun to your head. My friend's brother resisted, and then they held a gun to his head, and he handed it over. And what did they find? They found that somebody had posted something on his wall that was sympathetic to the opposition. A signal came from the checkpoint up to a building, which led to a gunshot that then hit him in the head. So the reason this is worth highlighting is in the midst of a civil war, in the midst of an environment where such horrible things are happening, technology can create awareness. But in the case of Syria, at the end of the day, states with weapons, states with military, states with economic and political power are the only ones that are going to be able to truly intervene to stop the killing.
Again, in the book, we use an example from Somalia. And Somalia, for much of the last decade, has had no functioning government. Actually, things in the government department have actually improved in Somalia recently. And we use the example of you have a smartphone and there's no government. How important is that smartphone? Well, it's how your friends tip you off that the other gang is around the corner. It's how you use, we use a scenario in the book involving schoolgirls in Libya, which we also went to, where we talked to these girls, and they actually use Google Maps to figure out routes to school to avoid the NATO bombing. So again, you think the internet matters? It matters a lot. So the problem is, here you are in Somalia, and you're really smart, and you've got your smartphone, and you've got all your friends, and they're all tipping you off, and you get captured. first thing that people do is they take your smartphone, they impersonate you, and they lure all your friends to be killed.
Well, I'm still wrapping my mind around you going to the Syrian border. You're a Google executive. What are you doing there? What's your role going to the Syrian border?
So one of the things that, at Google Ideas, for instance, we always say is we focus on a particular category of internet user that's having the most difficult time. It's easy for us to focus on the types of internet users that we're all familiar with, but when you think about users in places like Iran and Syria that are not only caught in the crossfire of a physical war, but in the case of Syria, they're caught in the crossfire of a more invisible war, which is the cyber civil war that's taking place. And so one of the reasons I went is to try to understand how is the average Syrian thinking about their own security? How aware is the average Syrian of what the Syrian Electronic Army is doing? Are they using two-factor authentication? Have they heard of it? Do they not understand it? And the conclusion that I came to from this last trip is there's a hyper-focus on dissidents and activists who by nature are more cybersecurity conscious than the average citizen. But in the last several years, access to the internet and mobile devices has really skyrocketed in places like Syria. The average person who thinks that they're safe because they're staying at home, not going outside, is in fact quite unsafe. And because they're not a dissident working on resistance on a day-to-day basis, the lack of awareness is more pronounced. And that, to me, was the most important problem to identify that we need to solve for. Because we want to ensure privacy and security of all users, by the way, from the US all the way to Damascus.
Yeah, which is a segue to the next topic I want to take up is that, here we found out, in the US, we're not overly protected from government listening to what we have here. So we learned a lot from the Snowden revelations. And I just did a big story in Wired about the tech companies and Snowden. And the thing that struck me the most, I was talking actually to the head of Google security, but he was talking very much in the same vein as his colleagues and other companies. And basically he said that the #1 adversary now in protecting user information is, he didn't say exactly what he described, it's the United States of America. Eric, when you heard about the Snowden revelations, particularly about how they related to Google's customers, were you surprised? Did that take you by surprise?
We were surprised. And the Snowden revelations included a report that the GCHQ, which is the British counterpart, had intercepted traffic between our data centers and that they had decoded internal protocols to try to figure out what people were doing on Google and try to figure out who people were and information. There was no evidence of this being used for any outcome that, that we know about. But the very fact that they would do this was very suspicious to us, and we were really quite upset about it. Now, the solution to this is to encrypt data at multiple points of source. And so we had already been in the process of doing this. We accelerated our activities, and we now, for the technical people in the audience, we use 2048-bit encryption, and we use perfect forward secrecy, so we switch the keys on every session. So it's extremely difficult to see how given the math around those kinds of things, somebody who got the encrypted text would be able to actually decode it. So we're pretty sure right now that the information that's inside of Google is safe from any government's prying eyes, including the US government's.
And when I did my story, a lot of the feedback I got said I wasn't tough enough on the companies. They said these companies, they should have known this. And Google's credit, they were the leaders in the encryption, and they were putting it in motion quicker than some others. Nonetheless, the question arises: here you are, really examining this thing globally. Were you folks overly optimistic about?
All I can tell you is we were attacked by the Chinese in 2010, and we were attacked by the NSA in 2013. What can I tell you, right? These are facts. And we have strengthened our defenses in ways that we've said publicly and some other ones we've not disclosed. We think your information is very safe from what we view as inappropriate access by foreign and domestic governments. It's important to know that under the US Patriot Act and through the FISA courts, which is, again, all public information that's held in American companies can be under a secret judge subpoena be taken. And that issue has been well publicized. And one of the issues that was brought up to Obama is that court a sort of a kangaroo court? In other words, does it have an appropriate real court structure where there's prosecutors and defendants and sort of argumentation? And that issue is unresolved in the current direction from the government.
So in your afterword to the book, you discuss this, and you seem to say that, okay, now we've learned this, and if this proves true to previous cycles, maybe now the balance will shift, and people will demand, that the NSA maybe back off there.
Well, it's not clear. Remember that there's a disagreement in the book. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We actually say that in the Hawks versus Dove fights, the Hawks usually win, because the downside of a terrible attack is seen as direct, whereas the upside of freedom and the lack of, if you will, the chilling effects of these things is not quantifiable. We also say in the book very clearly that you should fight for your privacy or you'll lose it. And you'll lose it because of a series of examples of this, right? So as an example, the NSA has already said publicly that 330 million people's metadata, that is phone call records, are being stored, including all of us, in return to target roughly 57 people, of which one was maybe a terrorist and maybe not. I'll let you guys decide whether that's an appropriate use of government power and monopoly power, and there are disagreements among legal scholars and judges and circuit courts and so forth on this. This particular facility, which is it's called the Section 215, was authorized in something called the Business Records Act, which was interpreted by a set of very clever lawyers to include metadata collection. That authority expires in June of 2015. I think it's pretty unlikely that authority will be renewed, is my opinion. So we are, in fact, having the debate. And in the book, we sort of talked about this. In democracies, companies will find the right balance for themselves. And I'll give you an example. In America, we're having that debate right now. My opinion is 215 will not be renewed. And so the issue, to some degree, goes away and replaced maybe by others. In Britain, nobody cares about this at all. It's seen as perfectly fine. They're used to being under surveillance in London streets. In Germany, people are aghast at this, and they view it as a horrific invasion of privacy. And in Brazil, people are also very, very concerned about this. All four very strong, functioning democracies with different outcomes.
And also, in the book, we express a real concern about the future of bulk leaking. Right? So I mean, leaking has been around since the beginning of time. What's new is the ability to do it in bulk. And if you think about somebody leaking millions and millions of documents, they have no ability to read every single one of those, make a calculation about what type of risks it's creating for people overseas and domestically. And we also take a strong stand in the book that there's a danger in people self-appointing with regards to the task of determining what should be known and what shouldn't be.
We went to visit Julian Assange when he was on his, shall we say, GPS locator service. And he, and you can read the transcript of our meeting because he leaked it. And
surprise, surprise, right?
We were shocked. Shocked, absolutely shocked. We never occurred to us.
Who was behind it, though?
We never occurred to us that he might leak that transcript.
Of course, the advantage is it's 5.5 hours, so nobody ever makes it through the entire.
Actually, I read it.
By the way, that was a joke. So we're clear. In the era of Twitter, you actually have to state it was a joke. In any case, we really did.
I read it, and actually, it sounded like you guys were having a pretty cordial conversation. Well, I skimmed some of it. There.
Well, in any case, one of the key parts of the conversation, which again you can read online, is the sort of core question of who gets to decide. And I think both of us felt that who gets to decide what information is public is a pretty fundamental issue in a democracy. And I think our general view, and we say this in the afterwards, is that I don't think we want random people leaking large amounts of data. For example, we don't want random people leaking large amounts of tax records or health records or any of the other kinds of things. I don't think that serves society. It's better off to have other mechanisms for whistleblowers that don't involve the data permanence problem, because the information once disclosed is there forever and can be used against people.
By the way, Julian called you, after his comment on your book, he called you witch doctors for technocratic imperialism.
Yes, that was a first.
We've never been called that.
Does this mean you're not going to a session at South?
We've never been called that. He did write that from his new residence in the embassy.
Well, and then there's Mr. Snowden. Again, I think you take a similar tack to him there, that you feel that what gives him the right to do all this leaking. Though, you know, we're talking about it and we're having this debate, and you know, and you just talked about the value of the debate. A lot of people think, you know, and I'd almost say it'd be the majority of people's impressions, that it was good that he brought this out, that we're talking about it now, and we would not have done this otherwise.
Well, what's interesting is one of the things that's different with Snowden, say from Manning or others that came before them, is if you look at, there's been studies that have been done on the public perception of Edward Snowden over the course of the last 9 months. And this ability to leak in bulk and do a remote drop, you know, outside of the border of the country that's trying to arrest you and prosecute you, means that there's a celebrity factor around the people that are doing this now that lends itself towards more copycatting. And every individual is different, and different people have different levels of judgment. There's a real concern that we talk about in the book about the nature of celebrity driving more and more of these.
Well, if it's a celebrity who releases stuff that we should know about, what's wrong with that?
People get hurt. And it's very hard to see how in 1 million documents you could be sure that as a result of this disclosure, somebody doesn't get killed. Thank goodness it does not appear that that has occurred with Snowden. But you have to think about this. It's not as simple oh, these governments are evil, you know, they shouldn't be doing this. The Assange argument, which again you have read, is actually to some degree very appealing. What he says is that individual evil between one person and another, it's sort of hard to control. So if somebody gets mad and shoots somebody or so forth. But his core argument, which I think is, as I said, is appealing, is that if you're going to do something systematically evil, you have to write it down. And if you write it down and then people leak it, it serves as a check and balance on the government. The problem is who makes the decision of what gets written down. So Jared and I wrote a fictional scenario of a country that we called Wikistan. And the idea was that it was one of those vaguely Scandinavian countries full of liberal people. And what happened was they decided that his argument was right and that there was no right of government privacy. You had personal privacy, but not government privacy. So everything the government did was immediately leaked by law. And so in this particular scenario, this works until another country decides to give them information which they then have to leak. So then they become a conduit of leaking. And then another country decides to do bad things to them, and so they have, you know, drones or cruise missiles or something, and they decide they have to launch them. But in order to launch them under their law, they have to announce the targets before they launch the missiles. So again, the absurd story, it's clearly absurd, is to illustrate that there is a role for secrecy that has to be very narrowly defined, right? And I think the solution to this problem is a couple-fold. First, there are things which probably need to be secret, and it's clear that there are many things in America that should not be secret that have been classified because the government doesn't want to be embarrassed. And this is generally known as the overclassification problem. It's been identified. Nobody seems to have figured out a way to solve this problem because people don't like to be embarrassed. They classify the information. And the second thing is that when a government using its power of law aggregates data about you and I, there's a danger of its misuse, and in particular, a danger that it would be leaked by somebody who sees it as being misused. And I think that those principles are new principles for most people in the digital age, and governments are going to struggle with this because it's a new framing of old problems.
One thing you also do in the book is you discuss a lot, something that's come up post-Snowden, is the issue of internet balkanization. And that's where, you know, countries basically decide to build some sort of virtual wall or want to keep their citizens' data within its borders. And you know, this was a movement that got a lot more traction after Snowden. And Brazil has gone down that step. And, you know.
There's a serious danger in Brazil. There's a law in the equivalent of their Congress that's being debated now that would essentially mandate data be kept in the country. There is a misperception of this because under American law, an American company's operations in a foreign country are still governed by the FISA courts. So the likely scenario is that this will force not just a partitioning of the internet, but also essentially a sort of a domestic industry of people trying to compete with the American companies. So it's a lose for the American companies, it's a lose for the good openness. Yeah. I think Jared and I would both say that the reason we do what we do is we believe in an open and free internet for all citizens, not just Americans, not just Europeans, not just Chinese.
Are we on the path then that that's not going to happen? You talk in your book of saying we might need a visa to get into other countries, the internet.
Well, one of the reasons, if you read the chapter in the book on the future of states and how they'll interact with each other, we paint a very scary picture of what a world would look like where the internet is balkanized. Mm-hmm. And the argument that we make is, states have a hard enough time implementing the laws of the physical world, let alone, trying to implement those same laws in the online world. And so the natural reaction is going to be that states will try to balkanize their internet. The reason this is so dangerous, and we talk about this at length in the book, is what are the limits to it? So the big fear is what happens when like-minded states band together to engage in collective editing of the web. You could imagine a situation where a group of autocratic countries, 10 autocratic countries on different continents, basically agree on a core set of principles around discrimination of certain minority groups, discrimination of each other's opposition groups, limits and restrictions on free speech, and all of a sudden they start acting as a mass. Mm-hmm. And think about what this would do to the online world.
No, how can we stop this? How can we prevent this from happening? Or do you think it's inevitable?
Well, we're very worried about it. And imagine a scenario where the Arab world decides to delete all references to Israel, right? Mm. I don't think that serves the Arab citizens, and it's certainly not good for Israel. It's better for people to know each other's points of view. Our core belief is that humans are good and that giving them information empowers them to understand both the strength and limits of the people around them. That inserting doubt in the North Korean person's mind will help them understand that it's time for perhaps a new regime, right, or a new approach to government in North Korea. And if you stop that, if you prevent that, you're doing a tremendous disservice to the people. We're very worried that not only will the balkanization occur, but it'll occur gradually in such a way people don't notice it. It looks like people are going to use child safety as the starting point. Now, everyone in this room is in favor of child safety. And I'll give you an example. Russia just passed a law which nominally about child safety, which allows for the pretty much arbitrary takedown of videos. And I was shocked when I studied the knowledge and understanding of Russian children that 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds were so concerned about opposition research speech. It's amazing how smart those Russian children are. American children are busy playing games. So there's something strange, or at least duplicitous, about starting from something which we all agree and then using that for other purposes.
There's a couple reasons why balkanization is going to be difficult, right? It's important to remember, there is good reason for optimism. The first is tanks and guns don't work in the online world. The second is the internet is transnational by nature unless we get to a point of balkanization, but we're starting with the default of it being transnational in nature. And what that means is, if Iran and a group of other countries try to balkanize the web, they're not just up against their own citizens, they're up against people all around the world. And Eric and I, in our travels to 40+ countries, we've never come into contact with somebody who aspires to connect to a heavily censored internet. It's just counterintuitive to what people want. And then the additional point that's worth noting, one of the things that we've observed is the more autocratic the country, the more online identities its citizens have. So the point that we like to make is Iran has a physical world population of 72 million people, but if every Iranian citizen that has access to the internet has their political identity, their social identity, various other identities, that population online looks more like 500 million people. And so it's already the case that repressive regimes are outnumbered, but when their citizens are online, each with a virtual entourage, the advantage goes back to the citizens.
And Iran, by the way, is the one country that's actually publicly announced that their goal is to separate themselves from the internet and produce what we would think of as an edited intranet, which they control all the borders of, and nothing would go in and out of. We've looked at this, and there are a number of companies here at South by Southwest that are working on encryption tools that are likely to make it impossible to do the kind of balkanization, at least for these sort of hard, tough censorship regimes, that the quality of the ability to evade those systems is going to be improving to the point where I think we both would say that within maybe a decade, it'll be impossible for governments to shut that down. So they'll have to come up with other ways of trying to shut it down.
So let's talk about privacy a little, you know, what you call data permanence there. Let me quote a book here, your afterword here. You say data permanence, that means the, you know, persistence of something on the internet, you know, once it's there, is a hallmark of the digital era, and there's simply nothing we can do about that fact that what we do today is recorded and stored with no expiration date and no erase button. And that really struck me. I mean, and I wonder, you know, whether, you know, I don't know whether it's your intent to say that, but I wonder whether some people might think that here you folks are, you know, you both work now for Google. It's a company that, you know, benefits from the availability of things that it searches for, just in the same way Jeff Bezos says, well, it's not me who shuts down these brick and mortar stores, it's the internet, yet he benefits from this. Are you saying that this is like our problem and that the tech companies sort of shrug their, you know, their shoulders and say, it's the internet, you know, you got to live with this?
I don't think we're taking a position on our own culpability on this. Obviously, we're part of the internet infrastructure. People do use Google to search for things without question. And indeed, Google's presence had made information that was public but hard to find easier to find. There's no question about that. Let me give you the example. You and I are old enough to remember that when you were a teenager and you made a mistake, right, there were juvenile courts. The judge would sentence you to juvenile hall or what have you. And then as you become an adult, you could petition the court and get the right to then say, I was never convicted of a crime for a certain category of crimes. And this struck me as a sort of a reasonable statement, right, that physical maturity, emotional maturity of teenagers is not the same. They're not adults, at least for most crimes. You can't do that anymore because the person that you apply for a job, you say, I was never convicted of a crime. They do a simple web search, right, and there it all is. Now, we're not suggesting the editing of the web, we're not suggesting taking that information down, but that justifies that sentence alone, right? The fact of the matter is the stuff is recorded. Jared would argue that, you know, you need to really think twice about what you're publishing because that stuff will be around forever.
Yeah, you talk about the new equivalent of the birds and the bees talk.
Well, so we actually talk a lot about parenting, and full disclosure, I will be a parent in 5 weeks, so I've thought a lot about this, and you know, Eric's been trying to coach me on it.
Jared, this is not the first time someone has had a child.
As you remind me all the time. But what's interesting is we've talked to parents in every country that we've been to, and everyone from, you know, New York to Riyadh has the same conclusion, that kids are coming online, you know, younger than at any other time in history, and the things that they're saying and doing are far outpacing their physical maturity. And so, you know, as people who live here in the United States, we're concerned about, you know, what that does for their career prospects and so forth. But you talk to parents in Saudi Arabia, you know, for them, you know, you realize how high the stakes are. So you hear a story about, you know, my daughter is, you know, chatting to a boy. I don't know what she's saying. She's 10 years old. Maybe it doesn't matter when she's 10. But because of data permanence, you know, let's say she's saying things that are inappropriate, it might follow her around like a digital scarlet letter for the rest of her life, waiting for somebody to take it out of context. And so you realize that parents all around the world are concerned about this. What we say in the book is, you know, at the end of the day, parents need to perhaps have the data permanence conversation years before they ever have the first sex conversation because it's going to be relevant.
And you know, you sit there
probably
and you go,
just as effective too.
Well, you know, like the birds and the bees talk, they want to know what it sounds like.
I guess we'll find out. But the fact of the matter is there's two big changes that have occurred to society. I mean, we've always had issues of privacy and issues of criminality and issues of, you know, politicians and political speech and all the things we've been talking about. There are two new things. The first is the extraordinary empowerment of citizens by these mobile devices. And these mobile devices are supercomputers. They're not just phones, right? They do amazing things. There are startups here that are doing the next generation of social interactivity to solve every known problem people have and some they didn't know they had, which is great, right? The other thing is that information once published publicly is not really revocable. Now, 97% of that information is stuff you've chosen to publish or someone has published on your behalf. So again, I feel sorry for the 16-year-old girl who's, and talking to her brother, whose video of her drunk throwing up is now permanently on YouTube because her girlfriend, published it in a spit of, in Pike, right? And that'll never go away. And the best thing she can hope for is it gets buried.
We do say in the book, and we sort of,
Well, Jared, let's just be clear. you have a plan for your daughter.
Which you disagree with.
Well, what happened
what's going on
so
here?
he spent a year on a campaign to not allow sonograms to be published before the birth of the child.
And the logic was a child should have to at least burp, laugh, or smile in order to say it's okay.
Clearly, you've not had a baby. So your new campaign is to, you told me you're going to basically create an email that you're going to track and publish all of the information to the child from birth.
So, sort of. The idea is when you send photos to family members, you CC your child's email address and then hand over the password when she's 18.
Jared,
And you told me that's a terrible idea.
Okay, so let's just see. Do we think this is going to work? So the other idea that you had is your view of parenting involves clear control over your child. So you want to, so you want to keep her password, and you're going to confiscate stuff? I lost this argument.
So when she's a teenager and her friends come over, they're going to have to all hand over their cell phones. I don't want
Okay,
to
can we just have a
Wait
little,
a minute,
can we have a
cell
survey
phone?
here?
By the
Who
time
thinks,
she's a teenager, they'll be wearable. Don't want to be on the glasses.
What are you going to do? You're going to take off all of their digital devices. By then, there'll be a lot, right? You're going to have them check them at the door in the mudroom with the coats?
I didn't say it was a good idea. I said it was aspirational. Now we do talk in the book. You know, we're obviously half joking. We do talk in the book about ecosystems developing around this idea of data permanence. And I don't know if we said this jokingly in the book or if we actually think this will happen. But you could imagine parents taking out insurance policies against their kids doing something stupid that lives in data permanence. You can literally imagine people taking out insurance policies against what they say and do online.
Well, there's another strain of sort of the David Brin school of thought is we find out everything and things maybe don't become so embarrassing. There was a time when you couldn't be a high government official if it came out that you smoked marijuana.
Well,
now we have a president.
It's possible.
Who's,
I mean, people forget that when John F. Kennedy was running for president, there had never been a Catholic president, and then that became tolerant. So far, the trend is not in your direction, in favor of your direction. That in our political sphere, what happens is there's this sort of gotcha research and opposition research. I have a friend who's a Republican senator in a southern state who had just almost lost his position based on a Tea Party attack. And he looked at me, and he's an older gentleman, and he looked at me and he said, I have written on my mirror as I shave in the morning, there are cameras everywhere, be careful what you say. Everyone is recording everything you say, including right now. Okay. That's the reality of what's happening. I don't think this is good. And what I hope is happening, you've made the argument, by the way, that much of this is a one-time secular change to a new model, and that we'll work this stuff out. I think part of what we wanted to discuss is understand that these simple answers of, oh, I want to publish this, or I don't want to publish that. Information is very powerful, and it can be used and misused. You want to respect that. I'm not in any way suggesting censoring, but you want to think about it.
Well, and the other thing we say in the book is in the next decade, you're going to finally have people running for office that are from the social networking generation. And there's probably going to be a whole wave of political casualties associated with people having unearthed things that they posted when they were in high school or younger that they thought was deleted, but somebody saved. And I think that there's going to be an aha moment as a particular generation becomes the largest voting bloc that actually does vote. I think there'll be an aha moment where people are just tired of it and don't want to be led by the leftovers. And it's hard to find somebody of a particular generation that doesn't have something that they posted that they shouldn't.
Right. So a couple more subjects I want to get to before we take questions here. One, sure you're both aware, and I don't know if you addressed it directly in the afterward, is in San Francisco now, there seems to be a movement pushing back against tech companies that are being identified. I guess on one hand, it's like a real estate issue of people, gentrification and pushing people out of their homes, raising real estate prices. But then there's another element to it when someone, recently was, identified as a source in a pretty favorable article actually about self-driving cars, and people went to this engineer's home and did this. Do you think that this might wind up metastasizing into a link, against people worried about their jobs from technology. And is this a sign of an uprising in that sense?
We're very, very worried about this issue, and the data suggests that the problem gets worse. If you look at the most recent studies of American economic growth, 99% of the people saw essentially no economic improvement over the last decade, and this has been sort of heavily analyzed and is highly true. So when you drive along the freeway and you drive, especially if you're visiting Austin, remember that you're driving these cute areas and wonderful little blocks. The average person there has not benefited from the globalization, the automation, the technology, and so forth. In San Francisco, the gentrification story has been going on for a very long time. It's been true since I've lived in the Bay Area for almost 40 years. But it's clearly gotten worse, and the tensions can get worse. So we need to do a whole bunch of stuff to try to ameliorate it. The longer-term solution is to recognize that you can't hold back technology progress. There will be people who will say, oh, the robot took my job and I don't want that to happen. You're much better off organizing society to take advantage of that technology. America in particular, and again represented by people in this room, is enormously creative. And I think for each and every one of us, becoming in favor of more education, more analytical education, more immigration, more capital formation, more creative areas, more areas that are allowed by regulation to be unregulated so that startups can actually flourish in them. And I mean this in places that are heavily regulated in telecommunications and in energy and so forth and so on. We can get through this. I'm actually much more worried about other countries, Japan in particular, Europe, where the economic structure, the companies, the cultural does not favor entrepreneurship. If you look at the solutions to the problems that you're describing, which ultimately lead to severe joblessness, they all involve creating more fast-growing startups. They're the gazelles, as they're called. And it's well established now that net job creation comes from new, fast-growing startups in any field that do something interesting and new and solve a new problem.
Yeah, but a startup, I mean, like the WhatsApp thing, there was, how many employees do they have?
They have about 50.
Right, and that's $19 billion. That's not
By
the
the way,
same as a big
let us celebrate capitalism. $19 billion, 50 people, good for them. Right? Good for them. Congratulations.
No one's going to stop a South by Southwest bus here, I can tell you that from that.
Who's next? What's the one at 20?
But you don't think we're at a point, because that maybe you could see that as the computer's capability gets so advanced and computers get so smart, there was even, like I did a story on a company that's actually trying to do my job. Now I'm really worried, in terms of writing stories.
No, but let's understand what's happening. There's a long-term trend away from farming to manufacturing, and then away from manufacturing to service industries. The manufacturing jobs that have been eliminated in the last 20 years have been replaced by service jobs with lower incomes. It's this problem. And so if you look at the most automated automobile manufacturing, they make the same automobile with far fewer people and more robots. Robots are replacing repetitive human tasks. This is progress. It has a displacement component, but eventually it makes us more productive as a society. The same thing is about to happen with repetitive knowledge workers. That is, people who don't have a particularly critical, creative, caring role. There's a good danger, bad in the sense of it's bad for them, danger that those jobs can also be automated by automated services. So in your case, because you're in fact one of the sort of top reporters and writers, I'm not too worried about that. But I'm certainly worried about the person who's not at your level, where a computer can generate excerpts that are good enough, right? So it puts you at a competitive, you have to compete, if you will. That. My own view is that in the automated world, incomes will go up for people who work with computers, work with robots, and they'll go down for people who don't embrace it, and that's a problem. If you look at manufacturing today, and I'm part of a White House study that looked at this pretty thoroughly, there are shortages of sophisticated manufacturing skills. They're literally throughout the Midwest, in all of the hard-hit places, because the new devices that you use to manufacture things require very sophisticated operators, and the existing workforce doesn't have those skills.
So I'm going to alert you to the microphones there, but and while you do that, I want to ask just Jared one more question here. You're involved in sort of a moonshot at Google Ideas, aren't you? Can you talk just briefly about that?
Well, it's, as we mentioned before, Eric and I have spent a lot of time traveling around to various autocratic countries looking at the last frontier for the internet. And before that, I've spent a lot of time living and researching in autocratic countries. And so there's no shortage of conversations related to last mile access, closing the digital divide. But we need to have a conversation about making sure that once people get access, the access that they're getting is in fact something similar to what we've experienced. And so we have this moonshot goal that within a decade, we can hopefully make repressive online censorship irrelevant. And it's an ambitious goal, and it's one that requires the work of an entire ecosystem, companies, nonprofits, activists, et cetera, but we believe we can get there.
What's interesting is imagine if the State Department had such a team. Our foreign policy would be very different. We would actually be able to do that. And this is another example where technology can really be used to provide American values and keep the internet open.
And there's something prescriptive in what Eric is saying as well, which is if you think back to the days of the Cold War, people who wanted to change, the geopolitical framework of the world, they learned Russian. After 9/11, I remember everybody was learning Arabic. If you think about the next language that people need to learn, it's computer language. Right? It's a totally different way to think about language, and what it means is a younger generation that grew up with these technologies is going to be better positioned to lead not just in the private sector, but also in the public sector.
Well, great. Before you get questions, I both want everyone to thank Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sure, great discussion. So I have a question about data persistence and the long-term effects. So you seem to imply that you think a habituation effect will take place, okay? But I'd like to ask you to comment on something a little differently. I run a website for millions of children, and at CES I was on a panel with a Brazilian and a French person talking about what kids should have access to on the internet. And about halfway through the panel, the Brazilian looked at me and said, "Why don't you guys in America stop imposing your crazy, strange view of social behavior on the rest of us?" I remember a few years ago when the Prime Minister of France was questioned about the fact that he had a mistress, he told the American reporter, "That's none of your business." So my question is, how much does the US-centric sense of what is sort of ethical and moral, which one could argue is not particularly connected to how humans actually live, how much of that is influencing the internet, and whether it might actually happen as a consequence of reality showing up on the internet is that we as a culture change our rather strange attitudes towards how people are supposed to be as compared to how they actually are.
I would answer by saying that I think we have benefited enormously by being the inventors of the internet. Because as we invented it and as it is spread around the world, it does in fact imbue American free speech, for example. If you think about it, imagine that the Chinese had invented the internet and they were very good at it. You'd see block by block, block chaining, censorship, deep packet inspection, all in the initial protocols. And it'd be very, very difficult to evade it. So there is a charge that it's really an export of American values. I would say that we benefited it, but I also think that the technology naturally is organized this way. And we say in the book, the data permanence is a natural consequence of having all these copies lying around. And the harder you work to try to eliminate copy A, the more likely copy B and copy C are around, and this is well known.
In your book, you predict that we'll see a market of real and invented identities, fake identities. Can you elaborate on that, and how will that comply with Google's real name policy?
So what we write about in the book is that you're going to see no shortage of situations where people for good and people for ill try to buy new identities on the black market. And we came up with this idea after going to Ciudad Juarez, just south of here, where you hear stories about people who reported crimes committed by the drug cartels needing to skip town and not be tracked. And so one of the challenges that we write about in the book related to data permanence is it's very difficult to escape your online identity. We don't know if it will be possible, but we certainly argue that people will try to package an entirely new identity for you that will allow you to sort of evade retribution for, say, reporting a crime.
And how does it comply with your real name policy in Google?
It doesn't exist yet. We're predicting the future.
Okay.
By the way, at Wired, when we had a reporter who tried to disappear, you couldn't do it. Our readers found him. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask about the economic consequences related to robotics and automation. And you touched on this a few times about the adverse impact on employment. At the same time, the collection and aggregation of personal information aggregates into an economic value for some. And we gave the example of WhatsApp, which aggregates personal information into economic value for a few with very low unemployment. And it strikes me that those two trends are not unrelated in the sense that we're seeing a movement of value away from manufacturing and to the collection and aggregation of data as value. Does that suggest that we need to rethink how income is distributed? Right. It seems that conventional methods of thinking about employment creation are no longer valid in the emerging world of transparent and complete data. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
I think we're going to see this debate. This will become the #1 issue in democracies. It'll be expressed as the jobless problem, but you've analyzed it correctly as it's due to many of these factors. And there'll be many, many suggestions as to how to address it. Changes in tax policy, changes in incentives, et cetera. I've already offered you my view, which is more education, more immigration, more connectivity, internet, and so forth. There'll be other people who have this view. We don't think we know exactly how to solve it. If you talk to economists as a group, and they're sort of dour on this, what they say is that the work week will get shorter, that fewer people will support more people who are not working, that the employment will be primarily in creative and caring industries, and that the human systems will have to adapt to all that. So a consequence of that reasoning, for example, is that you have to have enough of a safety net that somebody who is contingent employment, who used to have a nice manufacturing job, can actually at least live somewhere and have health care and things like that. And that's a political debate.
Eric, Jaron Lanier, in a recent book, I don't know if you read his recent book, postulated some system. He wasn't too granular about it, about how we would get paid for our behavior online, because it contributes to these companies here. Some sort of micropayment every time we do a search or express that we like something, this and that. Do you find any of that like a plausible plan?
We're pretty happy offering free services, and I think paying our users is sort of a step we haven't quite figured out yet. But I think we would argue today that the value that we provide justifies free, right?
Okay. Certainly you've got your users. Go ahead.
Hi, hello. I was wondering, what would your advice be to the Venezuelan people who are currently struggling to stop abuses by the government regarding the use of technology to solve the crisis in a peaceful way?
So I think that the challenge that Venezuela has is keeping a spotlight on Venezuela while there's many things happening that are gaining more attention in the media. So, the Venezuela crisis is happening simultaneously with Ukraine, but Ukraine really has the headlines. And there is an argument that when people are pushing for their rights, persistence pays off. The challenge in Venezuela, of course, is before Maduro was president and Chavez was president, you basically had an era in which the opposition was really beaten down. And so there's a challenge in any effort to affect positive democratic change in the sense that you can get lots of people into the streets around the lowest common denominator of not liking a particular autocratic leader. But it's very important that that revolution produces new leaders with new last names who can actually win and deliver. So I would say persistence and identifying who the leaders in the crowd are.
I don't think we've come up with a solution for governments that does not involve rule of law and some ability to put pressure on the dominant government through a political process. Nobody's come up with a better model yet.
This question is maybe more around diversity and politics. Recently, a lot of my friends in California are very upset about this Sxsw. Basically, they believe it will set an upper limit on how many Asian people will get into the public universities and possibly corporations, which will impact their employment opportunities. So I was just curious what your opinions are. Thank you.
I'm not familiar with the details of SC5. We are globally looking for the best talent everywhere. We want them to be able to get into the United States, and we're very happy if they are Asian, Hispanic, other minorities, African American, what have you. We just want you to be able to program. There's a huge shortage of these skills in America, and any step that diminishes that supply hurts our country.
Hi, guys. You touched on privacy and also the proliferation of cell phones sort of changing the world for billions of citizens. What are your thoughts on digital decentralized currency, namely Bitcoin, and
Did you lose any money today on the latest crash?
I'm long, man.
Is it really a hole in your pocket today, or was it the last one?
No, I bought it pretty early. So you know, how do you think it might affect the billions of unbanked citizens around the world?
So I think that there's two ways to think about it. There's two questions that are important to ask. One is, what is the future of cryptocurrency? And I think it's very obvious to all of us that cryptocurrency is inevitable. There's lots of values to it. There's a danger in having it not be regulated in some form, but people will continue to debate that as this plays out. The second question is Bitcoin the model, or is Bitcoin going to be more like the sort of Napster of cryptocurrencies? And I think we don't know, right? You know, this is still a pretty new space. It's only now that people are beginning to talk about it. The big issue that doesn't get enough attention has to do with the digital wallets. So everybody talks about the different cryptocurrencies and the exchange houses, but there's lots of examples of people trying both unregulated and regulated cryptocurrencies, where ultimately what leads them to break down is the inability to keep the wallet safe.
You touched on a few of these things, but I kind of have a more specific question. I am a teacher of gifted students who are young, and we're currently in a futures unit. We're told every year as teachers we're preparing students for a future that is very unknown, for careers that don't exist. And recently there was an article that even came out that said maybe they don't need higher ed and things like that. So my question to you is, what kinds of things, and I work a lot with creativity with students, so what kinds of things do you think we need to be preparing our students to study for their future?
So there are various people who run around and make claims that higher education is not a good use of your time.
Right.
They're just wrong.
I know.
And we can say this with great accuracy because people have studied this for decades.
I'm aware of this.
And just so everyone else clearly hears, send your kid to college and send your kid to graduate school if he or she wishes to,
right, but then
or
there's
whatever.
a cost issue as well.
Well, figure out a way to do it, and here's why. And by the way, I appreciate it's expensive, and we need to fix that.
We do.
The economic return to higher education over a lifetime produces significant compound greater earnings. So if all you care about is money, you should go to college. If all you care about is culture and creativity, you should go to college. If all you care about is having fun, you should go to college. Go to college. I can't be any clearer. Now, if I were you with gifted students, I would actually try to work on not so much the domain area, but rather what the general term is called grit, perseverance. It looks like the thing that separates out the sort of capable students from the really successful ones is not so much their knowledge, but their persistence at something, their ability to focus. And you're clearly a gifted teacher yourself. Figure out a way to teach that, because that's going to be the thing that will distinguish them.
Thank you.
Wow, after that, I want to go back to college.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Johmani. I'm a Syrian entrepreneur. Thank you for your note about Syria. I have a request for Eric. I hope you will not disappoint me. I would like to come and meet you in the Google headquarters, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I came all the way from that part of the world to here to request that.
I'm sure we can arrange something. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm worried about you poking the NSA. Do you anticipate a real backlash from them or the government as a whole because you keep making it harder for them to steal our data?
Okay, next question.
Just in the spirit of this event, I was going to ask you your sort of digital deities, and if you could take pause for a second and give us your favorite piece of music, a film, and a piece of technology that you are most looking forward to.
Jared, you can do the second one.
Okay.
You're the stylish of the two. On the poking thing, we didn't have a choice. We're not trying to annoy them, but we are trying to keep them honest and legal. And I worry that without oversight and without people watching things, misuse can occur. I really do genuinely view this, and not just the US government, but anywhere. And I'm very proud of Google's response here. I think we did the right thing. The fact of the matter is that somebody within those organizations should have said, what happens when it's discovered that we're doing this? It's a lack of self-awareness in my view. So we're certainly not trying to poke them, we're certainly not to provoke them. They don't actually call and ask our permission for things, so we'll see what happens. I think we don't know.
I get the more fun one. The best film I've seen recently was Captain Phillips, because I went to Somalia about a year ago to interview incarcerated pirates. So it was interesting to watch how they were captured.
Come on, Dallas Buyers Club was much better.
I haven't seen it yet. That's your thing. And then in terms of music, I've started paying more attention to electronic dance music because I'm on the board of a company called SFX, which is active in this space. So turns out I actually enjoy it. And then in terms of technology, I love things that like Chromecast and Apple TV that allow me to buy a television without having to buy a cable box.
Well, I've enjoyed being 20 feet from stardom. And
by the way, Steve, thank you. You have spent 30 years, I think, chronicling the development of this industry, and it was extraordinary that you'd be willing to do with us. So thank you so much for doing this with us.
Oh, and thank you both.
Thank you.